Hi, and welcome to Ask Cam. This week we are talking to two of our money advisors, and we're talking all about Debt Awareness Week. So this week, from starting Monday and ending on Sunday, it is Debt Awareness Week, and really focusing on the importance of talking about if you are struggling with your finances, how to get those conversations started, who you should be talking to, and what we can do for you. So welcome to Andrew and Rory. I'm going to allow you to introduce yourselves and just say a little bit about what it is that you do at Citizens Advice. So I'm going to come to you first, Andrew.
Hi, my name's Andrew. I'm currently working as a debt caseworker for the Money and Pension Service Debt Advice team. I've been in the role for coming up to 2 years next month. Prior to that, I worked for the consumer service as well, so I've been within Citizens Advice for a little while. And in terms of what I do sort of on a day-to-day basis, I'll be doing scheduled appointments with clients, so sometimes 2 or 3 clients a day. I'll be writing up documentation and completing budgets to send to them. Sometimes more hands-on stuff like negotiating with creditors or doing follow-up calls or helping clients to apply for certain funding and that sort of thing. So that's sort of what my usual day looks like and what my role consists of.
Great, thank you very much. And over to you.
Hello, my name is Rory. I'm currently working as an advice support worker on a secondment as a trainee debt advisor. Basically split between those 2 roles. In my advice support worker role, I would offer support to the caseworkers. I would do things like trust funds for energy suppliers. I'd also do DRO referrals. In the other role as the trainee debt advisor, I would give out debt advice primarily by email on a whole range of different things. But then I've also started to take on calls as well. But I've only been in it for 8 months, so I'm fairly new to it and I'm still learning at the moment.
Great stuff. Well, we're all still learning, so that's it's good to know that sort of the breadth of experience that we have in the room. So let's start talking debt advice and Debt Awareness Week. So why overall, I mean, it's a big question, but why sort of might people come to us for money advice? So what sort of things are people struggling with when they come to us for help? Andrew, I'm going to come to you first.
Yeah, obviously it's a whole variety of issues, really. We tend to find that, a lot of people might be on benefit only incomes, or maybe they have health issues, but that's obviously not the case across the board. We speak to lots of different people from lots of different backgrounds, people where everyone in the household is working, or where you might look at their level of income and think, they're in a good job, but ultimately, debt, one of the things you learn in this job is that debt can affect anyone, and we do get people from all sorts of different types of backgrounds who come to us. A lot of the moment are people who may have had what we refer to as like non-priority debts, like credit cards and loans and that sort of thing building up. And a lot of the time we see that's either an older debt where it has been affordable for them, but because of a recent change it's not, or sometimes even where people are relying on those lines of credit to support themselves in other areas like paying their rent or their mortgage when they are struggling to get by. A lot of people, obviously, with everything that's going on at the moment, gas and electric is a big thing that comes up a lot. But I think most of the time, sort of 2 clients are never really the same. And like I say, we do get a lot of people from various different backgrounds who are struggling, for whether it be because they might have had a recent health issue, where they might have had a relationship ending, and that's affected their financial situation, people leaving the home. So yeah, a real wide variety of them. But like I say, at the moment, definitely we've seen a lot more people who, like say, of having issues with their energy or their council tax, or even their the housing related costs as well, seems to be coming up quite a lot recently.
Roy, would you say that's the same sort of experience for you?
Yeah, I would say it's the exact same. As I said, I do emails for the majority of my trainee role, and again, each email is completely different. It could be someone who has, as Andrew says, recently went through a change of circumstances, like a death, a relationship breakdown, or even just losing their job. To someone who is just on their last legs and really has to get stuff sorted out, or has enforcement agents visiting. So I mean, it does really affect loads of different people, and I think obviously the circumstances at the moment is bringing more and more people to Citizens Advice. Obviously you have the energy crisis, you have every time you refer to the news, everything's going up, and I think people are really starting to feel the impact of that, on their day-to-day lives. And you're having a lot of people who, as Andrew says, who would be on a decent income, but again are still affected by debt, or as you said, non-priority debts, relying on credit cards to meet your bills, or relying on loans maybe just even to sustain the lifestyle that you're normally living. But again, as Andy says, it's such a wide range of people that are coming to us for advice, and it's from all walks of life. It's not just those who are just on benefit only income, or those who are just referring to food banks. It's literally every walk of life that is coming to us for advice.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's, as you say, it's sort of a lot more people who are starting to be hit now who maybe wouldn't have ever thought that they might need our services, and suddenly are sort of needing to reach out. I should just add at this point, by the way, I forgot to mention at the beginning, that if you are watching live and you have a question for one of our advisors, please do feel free to pop it in the comments box on whatever platform you're reaching us on, and we'll do our best to answer those live. If you're watching this on catch up, please feel free to comment anyway, and hopefully we will be able to point you either answer your question or be able to point you in the direction of the answer at a later date as well. So don't feel that if you're not watching live that you've missed out. So we've obviously talked about the fact that people are coming to us more for help with money as that sort of cost of living crisis kicks in, if you like. So is there, I know that energy is the thing that most people talk about when we're talking about cost of living, and that is a real factor. Can we talk a bit more about that, but also sort of, are there other things when we talk about that sort of cost of living crisis that you're sort of starting to see people really struggling with? Rory, I'm going to come to you first this time.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, well, obviously, as you said, energy is the big one as well. I think I see a lot of claims for council tax as well as rent arrears, but I sort of look at it as more like a holistic picture. When the price of groceries is going up, if you're on the breadline, as to speak, if the price of something just goes up incrementally, it's going to have a massive impact on you anyway as it goes. So I think that really does have an impact. Again, as you said, there's people choosing between what having to eat or what to heat. So I mean, I think I know we can think of other things in the cost of living crisis, but I think that the energy crisis is having such a knock-on impact on every other aspect of people's lives. It is something that when you see in the emails, a part of obviously the issue is that I can't afford to do this because of this. I think council tax, rent arrears, and again, the non-priority as well, it's just sort of eating into those people that are on, such low incomes. And again, as I said, even those that are just about have their heads above water, it's eating into that as well. But I think inflation is another big thing as well. Obviously, we're coming into April time, and it's the new tax year, and you're going to see a lot of, prices obviously go up across the board. So it's hard really just to put it down on the one specific thing. But again, I like to think of, looking at that advice as sort of like a holistic picture, and looking at everything in a more broader aspect, rather than going, it's just this specific thing here. And I think it would be beneficial for clients in that sense, to look at, their situations in a holistic picture, thinking, this is what's happening here, but let's think of options to deal with other things that may not be as bad. But yeah, definitely, I'd say just across the board, everything is just, increasing. And you have to think of, what solutions we can do just to manage it.
Yeah. Andrew, would you say that's the same from your perspective?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's pretty common now that the vast majority of people I speak to will mention prices going up, either just as sort of an aside, just they're saying, oh, this is happening and this is something else I'm worried about, or a specific reason why they're struggling. I think a lot of the time as well, when people are in debt, I think a lot of people, in terms of the advice we give, it's helpful for them to get advice on what needs to be prioritized and what doesn't. Sometimes you will get people who might be, just because they've got a creditor contacting them, or they've been told bailiffs are going to be involved or something like that, will end up using money that really would be better supporting them and their families to make payments towards that, because they're so scared of what the implication of that's going to be. And obviously part of what our service does is might say to people, well, yeah, we appreciate why you're concerned about this and why you're scared, and people hear about bailiffs and don't pay. They said, "See, don't pay, we'll take it away," and all that sort of stuff, and they'll think, "Oh, there's going to be bailiffs knocking my door down and taking my kids' things and all this sort of stuff." Whereas in reality, it's kissing. Well, actually, this is what their powers are or what their options are. There are options for you to deal with the debts and what those are, and sometimes it is just a matter of saying, look, stop paying this £50 a month to this person and use that to heat your house or buy food or whatever that might be as well. Because obviously I think with a lot of the things Citizens Advice covers, not just debt, a lot of the issue is just lack of knowledge by the public of these specific areas. If somebody hasn't been through the benefit system, obviously we don't specialize in benefits advice, but we advise people on benefits as part of our advice. And before I joined the debt team, I could have told you that universal credit was a benefit and child benefit, and that was probably about it. That was like the limit of my knowledge, and obviously I'd still worked at Citizens Advice for years before that. So I think it's the same with debt, it's the same with consumer advice, benefits, housing. Is just people don't know what bailiffs can and can't do, what creditors can and can't do, what options there are for people who are in debt and are struggling. And so, I mean, that's one of the more rewarding parts of the role, is obviously telling people that. But yeah, with prices going up and people having to really think, I've got this £10, what am I going to spend this £10 on? Am I going to pay it towards this creditor who keeps calling me every week? Am I going to pay it for, Sally needs a new pair of shoes, or am I going to spend it on the groceries this week? And you do get a lot of that, and it's obviously those are the situations that people are finding themselves in, like Rory said, where they're having to choose. I only have this finite amount of money, I've all these things I need to spend money on, and trying to make not a particularly nice decision on deciding how am I going to use this money and what's that going to mean moving forwards for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, like you say, there's a lot of difficult choices out there for people at the moment, having to sort of, heat or eat is the one that hits the headlines more often. And I think, it's obviously it's a lovely catchphrase, if you like, it rolls off the tongue quite easily, but obviously, whether or not it's a nice catchphrase, it's a horrible choice to be making. But equally, it's not just heat or eat, like you say, it's, kids' school shoes, kids' costs. It's, do you actually, how do you manage to pay your grocery bills? How do you pay for sort of other household bills? The things that are going to keep you protected. So there are a lot of difficult choices out there in terms of. So if someone, for example, as we've sort of touched on, there are now a lot of people who are potentially have maybe never had to think about sort of getting by before, or that they've always been reasonably comfortable, that are now starting to struggle with their finances and maybe aren't sure of where they should be turning. In terms of if they're thinking about potentially looking for advice, what are the first things that they should be thinking about doing? What sort of action should they be taking? Andrew, I'll come to you first.
So I think the best things to do in terms of what people can do by themselves is obviously getting an idea of what your actual income and expenditure is. I know personally, for a number of years I didn't sort of have a set budget, and then from encouragement from my mum, to be honest, I did actually sit down and get a proper budget together, and it gave me a much better idea of just where my money was going each month, identifying areas where I could possibly save some money, things that I might not need, like that Netflix subscription, or if you, for example, if you're going out once a week, then maybe you can be like, okay, I don't really need to do that. So I think first having an idea of what is my income and my outgoings is a good idea. Sometimes people are in a situation where you can't really reduce it, or reducing it is going to make life a lot more difficult. But I think as a baseline, having that so you know where you stand is a good idea. And also getting an idea of what your reasonable costs are versus what maybe you're struggling and surviving on. Because obviously if somebody, let's say, who is in these situations where they have very little money, might be cutting back massively on food, going for the cheapest stuff possible, maybe the more traditionally cheaper foods, like, a lot of rice and, those sorts of things that we hear about people having to do, or people who are having to go to food banks and look at, right, this might be what I'm surviving on, but what in reality do I need to get by, and looking at that as well. Because a lot of the time, if somebody does sit down and put, we're scraping by with this and this and this, and when they finish, they might go, oh, actually, I've got money left each month. Whereas in reality, that's only the case because you're making yourself struggle so much to get by. So I think that's an important thing. Getting a proper picture of your debts, what the balances are, what stage they're at. And then, obviously our website's a great tool. So, if some people can empower themselves to look into these options themselves, and obviously if they can, that's great. But there's a lot of information on there that people can look at. But really, I think, if people are struggling, if people think they are in a situation where they're not going to be able to afford to make payments towards their debts, then obviously reaching out to, their local Citizens Advice is a good thing to do. Because sometimes, like we've mentioned, it might be that people are sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul by cutting back on their expenditure and paying towards debts, where in reality there might be, like a debt relief order or bankruptcy or an IVA or a debt management plan, or all these different options that are available that might actually make their day-to-day lives better. Because obviously that's part of what we look at as well. We're looking at how to deal with the debts, but also how can we try and get you as sustainable as possible. And the other thing I'd mention is, again, sort of like touched on before, is just people not really being aware of like benefit entitlements and other support that's available to them. A lot of times I've spoken to somebody who might be already already getting benefits, and I've told people like you're entitled to an extra £300 a month, or you're being underpaid this, or you can get council tax support and you're not, and just things like that can make a massive difference, because a lot of the time people aren't getting what they should be at. I can't remember what the figure is, but the figure of like the unclaimed benefits that people are entitled to is like ridiculous. I think somebody told me it was like in the billions each year that doesn't get claimed that people are entitled to. So I think in terms of, people who are wanting to make a start at looking at their debts and their financial situation, that's probably the best place to start from.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously what we know, in terms of sort of almost there's quite a lot of stigma, unfortunately, around claiming benefits, and that people don't really want to maybe not look to that route because they don't want to kind of explore being on benefits. But actually it's a necessary support net. It's there to help people, from all walks of life, if you fall on hard times and if you're unable to make ends meet. And this is obviously a crucial point at which the benefit system is here to support you, and we would really encourage people to just make sure that if you're in any doubt, reach out and take that support, because it's really important that money goes unclaimed. It's set aside almost to meet the need of the population. So please do contact us, ask for support. Rory, was there anything else that you wanted to add about things like that?
I think Andy sort of really covered it. The most of it, obviously, as I said, the budget and benefit check. Obviously communicate. One thing I would probably say is to just maybe try and face it as much as you can. I think that's probably one of the main barriers that a lot of our clients have, is just actually facing the issue. Just approaching it head on and saying, this is what the circumstances are. I think a lot of people, obviously when you're getting letters to the door from your creditors with saying, maybe final notice or, demanding for payment, it can be quite daunting. And obviously, us as debt advisors, we understand, the stress that clients go through each day. But I think if you just try and communicate, with your suppliers, a lot of suppliers, for, like energy suppliers, as you said, or even your council, if you, communicate to them that you are struggling, or you communicate that your circumstances, they will try and come to some type of arrangement with you. And if you feel like you're not getting an arrangement with it, that's when you can, go to your local Citizens Advice, or, you can refer to us and we'll try and help you as much as possible. But I think, just trying to face it as much as possible and using the resources that are there. As Andy touched on it, there's a load of online resources. There's Turn to Us as a benefit check one. The website has loads of great web pages and stuff, because obviously, as Andy again touched on, that can be quite daunting. There's a lot of intricacies. There's lots of different different bits and pieces to different types of debts. But again, just make the most of the resources and know that there is a lot of resources out there to help you, and even suppliers are there to help you, and there is organizations that if it's not Citizens Advice, it's something we can refer you on to. If it's for housing advice, for shelter, or if it's for anything else, or mental health advice, we can refer you to Mind. There's lots of different things out there. There's lots of different resources that I think the public should try to use just as much as possible, just to make things a wee bit easier, and just to try and face the problem head on.
Absolutely, that's a really good point. I think we always say the earlier you can come to us for help, the easier it's going to be to try and unpick some of those issues. It doesn't make it mean it's going to be easy full stop, but it's just the quicker we can get wheels in motion to help you, the better. So I've just popped up as well our telephone number and also our website. So you referred to both of those while you were chatting, the pair of you. So if people do want to get in touch with us, those are the best sort of possible ways. And obviously on our website, as well as our just sort of a lot of information and self-help pages, we also have a whole range of online options and ways that people can contact us. So if you're not able to call us for whatever reason, that doesn't mean you can't get in touch with us, and you can reach out to us like that instead.
Yeah. Sorry, not just to jump in super quick, but one thing I was going to mention as well is obviously, like Rory said, it is a good idea to try and face up to it, but sometimes you aren't in a position to do so. Obviously, if somebody has maybe mental health issues or other things going on as well, obviously we've already touched on sort of the stigma and that sort of thing, which, really you would hope that is going to diminish with time and will continue to do so. But sometimes you just, for whatever reason, as a person, may not be ready to deal with it. Sometimes it's the smallest thing that can start you on the right path to dealing with it. Because, like I say, it can be a lot. Sometimes people have a lot of debts or a lot of different issues that need to be looked at. And even if it's just, if it's something, because obviously we hear a lot of people say, I just sort of buried my head in the sand and I haven't dealt with it and it's escalated. So I think one of the important things is that's okay. Sometimes for whatever reason people just aren't ready to deal with it. If you can speak to somebody about it, because with this sort of thing is a thing where the longer you keep it to yourself, the more worried and anxious and pressure you're going to feel about it, and possibly the less likely you are to deal with it. And sometimes I found from speaking to clients, even just having a clear plan, or even just having one thing to focus on and then saying, and we can worry about the rest later, that's to some people is a big help. So even if it is just putting your budget together, even if it is just speaking to one of your creditors, even if it is just confiding in a friend or a family member or a work colleague or whoever it is, sometimes that's the most important thing. And sometimes people, your confidence will grow and you'll feel more comfortable with it. So yeah, if you're in a position to face up to it and deal with it, like Rory said, definitely do that, because as Rosie said as well, the sooner a lot of the time that you can get advice and get a handle on it, the easier it is, or the less stressful it is to deal with. But if you're also in a situation where you don't feel like you can, don't feel like that's a failing on your part, or that you can't do it in future, or you can't deal with it gradually over time.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point. Like, as you say, it feels like a big step, and if all you feel able to do at any point is maybe have a conversation with a family member or a friend who you wouldn't previously felt able to say, do you know what, I'm just finding things a little bit difficult financially. That sometimes can be the sort of starting point that you need to kind of almost to admit it to yourself, to kind of start taking steps forward. It doesn't have to necessarily, as you say, be about reaching out for a big intervention straight away. It's about taking the first step is always the hardest bit, isn't it?
I think even if it's a small step or if it's a big step, regardless, it's still a step in the right direction. I think, just as I said, just get the support, whether it be online, whether it be speaking to someone, just try and get as much support as possible. If you're going through a situation where you need that support.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it kind of probably leads us on a little bit to my next question, which is, I think for some people, again, the idea of coming to us for debt advice feels very big and overwhelming, and sort of saying, actually, it almost puts them off coming in the first place, because they think it's going to be this quite big undertaking and quite a big and daunting process. So could you give us a bit of a feel for, if someone comes to us for money advice, what might a typical appointment, if there is such a thing, what might that look like, so people know kind of what to expect, and hopefully that it's not actually quite as scary as they might think it would be. Whoever wants to jump in first.
Do you want to go, Andy?
Yeah, sure, I can. That's fine. So, yeah, a normal appointment in terms of the structure, obviously, like we've touched on, every client's different, so things might go differently. But what we'll usually do is we'll try and get a picture of what your situation is, what your living situation is. Are you renting? Do you own the property? Those sorts of things. Who are you living with? what's the income coming into the property? Are there any health issues that we need to know about that might affect your entitlement? Are your options for dealing with the debts themselves? And we'll sort of have more of a chat about like how the debts have accrued, obviously, you know, with no judgment or anything, but just so we understand what's led to it and is there something we can do to stop that being an issue in future. Because obviously the ideal outcome is that people end up being debt free on a long-term basis is what we're always hoping for when we speak to someone. Once we've sort of got all that sort of background information, then we'll do a budget. So that's when we'll talk about the individual debts, what stage they're at, you know, if they've been passed to collectors, if there's been any court action. And we'll go over if the person has any assets, because like I say, we do get people from all different walks of life. So we get people who have no assets at all, people who own expensive properties and have cars and savings and all these sorts of things. So we'll get an idea of that. We'll go over the income and then the outgoings. And I think a lot of the time people do generally find probably the outgoings the most challenging bit, just because a lot of the time, and I say this to clients on a daily basis, is, you know, if you've got a mobile phone bill, you know how much that is. It's £25 a month every month and it comes out. Whereas if you say to somebody, how much do you spend on food, or how much do you spend on clothing across a year or a month, or how much do you spend on presents, those are social costs. Those are the ones that are a lot harder for people to think about. And obviously we can do estimates and that sort of thing, but we'll go over that. And then that gives us an idea, you know, a rough idea of what their situation is. Do they have any money available? Do they not? If they're in a deficit, how substantial of a deficit is that? And we'll do a benefit check and we'll see if there is any entitlement. Are the benefits they're not claiming? Are there any benefits they are claiming where they're being underpaid? Which, like I say, we do see quite a lot. Sometimes, you know, if people are claiming certain disability benefits, they might be entitled to additional elements. You know, people might not realise that they can get like a work capability assessment and those sorts of things. And then we'll talk about the budget itself. So if there's anything we identify, like, you could sell this asset, or this cost looks like it could be a little high, or this could be a cost you could reduce. We have that sort of conversation around the budget in itself. We'll discuss the benefit check and if there's any useful information from that or anything else they can claim, any other support. And then we'll sort of discuss the debts individually usually. So we'll usually discuss each debt, what the type of debt is, what the implications of that are and the best way to deal with it. And then we usually move on to sort of the more long-term options, like is a debt relief order an option, or bankruptcy, or making payment offers. And then from there, like I said, that's sort of the basis. But then from there, it really depends on the client. Sometimes it's arranging so a family member or friend can talk on their behalf, potentially if there's somebody who might struggle for whatever reason. Sometimes we'll send out authority to act forms, which is basically so we can contact creditors and people on their behalf if that's something that they need. And then, yeah, from there, it obviously varies client to client in terms of what we do. Sometimes, like Rory touched on earlier, we might apply for trust funds for people, help them to apply for insolvency options. And, you know, some clients we speak to, and it's one conversation, we'll send them their written information. So everything that we discussed during the call and all the advice we gave. And sometimes, you know, I've only been here 2 years, but I've had a client or two where it's been an ongoing discussion for like a year, where it might be every month or every couple of months, you know, they'll come back and say this has happened or that's happened, and then we'll update. So yeah, it is obviously relatively tailored to the person, but in terms of the basic structure, that's sort of what you can expect.
Yeah. So I guess like the important thing to kind of take away from that, I guess, is that you're not asking questions about anything you don't know necessarily. Like it's information that you have. It's not that we're sort of, and I think crucially what you were saying there is sort of the non-judgment about how those debts came to be. We're not here to talk to people about, you know, whether choices they should or shouldn't have made. That's not what we want to do. We just want to understand the position you're in at the moment and kind of looking at what you need to going forward. And again, that kind of idea, I think people sometimes have the idea that if they come to us for money advice, we're going to tell them, oh, you shouldn't be spending money on this, and you should, like, this is where you should or shouldn't be spending your cash. And again, actually, for us, what is a necessary cost it's not our place to make a decision. That's all about the individual, but that it's about understanding your circumstances. What do you consider to be the necessary costs in your life, and how do we make it so that you can meet them, I guess. Yeah.
And a lot of people, like, our budget is obviously set out specifically to try and cover everyone's costs. But the amount of times that I've mentioned something like, oh, how much do you spend on gifts? And they're like, oh, nothing, because that's not important. And I'm like, yeah, but right, but that's reasonable. It's reasonable for someone to buy a gift for someone for their birthday or for Christmas or any other, religious celebration they might have. And so, yeah, you might not need to spend it, and if you really couldn't afford it, you wouldn't have to. But that doesn't make it unreasonable, or being part of a sports club and paying money for that, or even going to the pub with a friend. I think these are the things that people, especially when they're in debt, like the sort of slightly silly thing I say is, just because you're in debt doesn't mean you should be sat at home eating cold tins of beans for the rest of your life. Like, that's not what that means. You're still entitled to a reasonable quality of life. Sure, if somebody comes to me and says I spend £2,000 on clothes a month, then we might say maybe that's not needed. But as long as, like you say, it's nothing that's excessive or is going to be questioned by the people who you have debts with, then, like say, it's perfectly reasonable, like you say. And it's not a matter of us saying you shouldn't be spending money on this. It might be us saying you could maybe cut this down. Or smoking and alcohol costs are ones that come up quite a lot. But as a former smoker myself, it's a matter of saying to people, it's not an on and off switch. It's not like cancelling a Netflix subscription or those sorts of things where you can just stop doing that and that's fine. You can't watch Squid Game or whatever anymore, but you're relatively fine. So like you say, and the other thing to remember is when you're speaking to a debt caseworker, they've probably spoken to somebody who's in a very similar situation that you are. And obviously, at the moment I have 13 appointments a week, so I'm potentially speaking to 13 people a week who are in debt and have been doing for the past year and a half. So again, in terms of the judgment, there shouldn't and won't be any, because like we've said, anyone can get into that situation, and you're obviously going to be contacting somebody who deals with people who are in debt and advises people who are in debt, and people who are in really bad situations, and people who are dealing with mental health issues and all sorts of stuff. So like say, when you do get through to somebody, we'll be as patient as we can with you. If you don't have certain information, that's fine. Like I said, there's time for people to go away and check things, because especially if it's been going on for a long time, or they have lots of debts, you might not know exactly how much money you owe to each person or remember who it was owed to originally. So I think definitely, especially with the stigma that get attached to it, and a lot of clients do sort of bring that up and say, oh, I feel ashamed or embarrassed that I'm in this situation. And obviously that's completely understandable, and I get why people feel that way. But I always try and make people feel better and let them know that it's not something they're going to be negatively judged about, and that hopefully it'll be a welcoming and accepting appointment, and that the people will come away from it feeling better.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I was just going to say, I mean, I think obviously the data appointments themselves can seem quite daunting, but I think when you think about it in the perspective of the client, like they still have control. We're just purely here to, as you said, advise them impartially, give them their options. It's really down to the client, like what they do with that information. As I said, it's just, I think the best thing to look at is, this is your situation. You can take the advice and you can make these decisions. And as you said, we're not going to judge on anything that you do or don't do. It's just our job here to advise you and give you your options. And as I said, it's up to you to utilize those options as best as you can.
Absolutely. So we've had a question coming from Helena, and I actually think for once I might know the answer to this question, but I am going to throw it to you guys as well, just in case. But so she's asked about, have we got any advice regarding, Martin Lewis had talked about topping up a prepayment meter to avoid the price increase, and sort of concerned that might get customers into debt because what they're paying on the meter would be cheaper than what the company would actually be charging. And will they be billed for the difference and made to pay it? So is that, for either of you, is that something you're familiar with, or do you like it?
I think if I'm understanding the question properly, I think because my dad literally, I work for Citizens Advice, and he still texts me about scams and things like this, and I'm like, I work for Citizens Advice, Dad, I know. But yeah, I think because it was a similar thing with because I'm not on a prepayment meter myself, but it was a similar thing that he told me about that Martin Lewis had said regarding submitting a meter reading as well. So my understanding of it is, if the prices are going to go up as of the 1st of April, if somebody was to top up before then they would be topping up based on their current rate for the energy. So as far as I understand, no, you wouldn't be charged because you have topped up that amount on that day, and at that point that is what your rate was. In the same way that if I submit a meter reading on the last day of the month, because the units that have, accrued in that time have been submitted, then it will be at that rate. Whereas if I did it 2 weeks later, it would be a mix of the two. So by my understanding, no, I don't think anyone should have a debt because of that, because it's the same as, let's say, if you go into a shop and buy a chocolate bar and it's £1, and then the next day the shop puts it up to £1.50, the shop can't come back to you and say, oh, you owe us 50p now, because that wasn't the price at the time. That's my understanding of it anyway.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Andy. And I think the crucial kind of thing to be aware of is that it does depend on the type of meter that you're using. So if you're using a smart meter, then unfortunately that doesn't apply, because your rates will kind of be updated as you're using that energy. But if you are using a non-smart meter and it's with everyone except, unfortunately, Scottish Power, it doesn't apply there. But with every other type of non-smart prepayment meter, so that's a very specific sort of group, but they're essentially, if you top up before March 31st, until that money runs out, all of your units will be charged at the rate, the sort of pre-April 1st prices, and it's only when you top up again that you'll start paying the new prices. So it's not going to get anybody into debt, but as long as you're on the right type of meter. But either way, even if you're not on the right type of meter, essentially there isn't a way you can get into debt, because you'll just be charged at the right rate. They won't charge you differently. So hopefully, Helena, that answers your question. If you are concerned at all and you do have any further questions, please do feel free to get in touch with us as well, because we do have specific energy advice teams who can help you if you're kind of struggling with any queries around energy advice. But thank you very much for your question. And I think something that people will be particularly thinking about. And again, as you said there, Andrew, if you're not on a prepayment meter, but you are on a regular meter, do make sure you submit a meter read on March 31st, so that everything gets sort of continued in, or doesn't get counted in past April 1st. So we've covered a lot about money and advice there. I think something that sort of, just as a kind of, you touched on it very briefly, but sort of bailiffs is a big thing that comes up for a lot of, and we get a lot of calls around, bailiffs are coming, or I've had notice that bailiffs are coming. And as you say, not many people are very aware of what bailiffs can and can't do, and the support that they can offer. It's sort of a quick, like the top sort of things that people need to know, I guess, about what bailiffs can and can't do when it comes to sort of enforcing payment.
Well, I think obviously they need to have you need to be served with the paperwork, and it's up to 7 days before they actually visit the property. So you need to make sure that you're actually getting letters from a bailiff. Probably the best thing to do is maybe check if it's a bailiff or a debt collector, because obviously bailiffs and debt collectors have different powers, but it's really not always clear if they are a bailiff or if they are a debt collector. Like me personally, sometimes if I'm dealing with a client's email and I hear a name of some collection agency, just a quick Google search, is this bailiffs? It'll usually tell you, if it's a bailiff or a debt collector. So just obviously bear that in mind. But in terms of obviously the bailiffs, you have to receive the paperwork at least 7 days in advance before they actually visit the property. And when they visit the property, they can't force entry through to your house. It has to be by peaceful means. So in terms of that, we would always advise the clients, to lock all their doors, lock their windows, so they can't force their way in. Obviously, as I said, and just if you're going to talk to them to the letterbox. Most of the times, they will just sort of leave the property if you don't really engage with them, because you're under no duty to actually engage with them. One thing probably would say, if you do have a car or anything like that, the best thing to do would probably be to lock it away in the safe storage if possible, or move it away so that the bailiffs can't remove it. But in terms of that, as I said, you're under no obligation to talk to the bailiffs. If it's something like council tax, or if it's from some other creditor, best thing to do is maybe contact the creditor directly and ask them, can you stop the bailiff enforcement, and try to come to some type of arrangement with them if possible, or even say to them, I'm going to approach Citizens Advice, or I'm currently speaking to Citizens Advice at the moment and I'm seeking that advice. I'd appreciate it, if you could place a hold on my account for 30 days. I said, it'd be down to the supplier, but at that stage, you're taking those steps to actively engage. But I think just knowing that, they can't act just any way they want. They can't force their way into their property. They can't take things, without you knowing, in that sense. And just knowing your rights. And again, if you're vulnerable as well, they have to abide by certain rules. And they can't, again, as I said, force away entry. And there are certain rules that you have to stick by. If you are vulnerable, again, probably the best point of reference would be our website for that. If you just search bailiffs and vulnerability, it'll come up with a list of things that the bailiffs can do, and things that you can also say to the bailiffs. And if anything does happen, that you can always report them as well, to directly to the enforcement agency. But again, it's just about knowing your rights, if those situations arise.
Absolutely, that's really helpful. Thank you, Rory. I guess before we wrap up, is there anything else that you kind of, if you do have the opportunity to say to people who might be struggling when it comes to money, what sort of support might they need to be aware of, and B, just what do they need to know? I think, as Andy, I'll come to you first, and then.
I think the main thing is what I touched on before. Obviously, with the way the world is now, and especially with us coming out of COVID, and that had a massive effect on a lot of people. During that period, it felt like almost everyone we were speaking to was saying, "I've lost work because of COVID," or some other impact of it. And we're still seeing that now. I think one of the things is that there are a lot of people who are in a similar situation, unfortunately, where they are struggling. I think it's important to know there is support out there. If you're in a really bad situation, there's things like food bank referrals. Sometimes there's fuel vouchers and things available locally, and other support. So that's really important. So a call to your local citizens advice, even if they won't necessarily do a full day appointment with you like we would, they can still be very useful in terms of starting your journey off and saying, these are things you can do now to get you by, maybe for the next week or a couple of weeks or whatever it is. While you're waiting to look at the bigger picture stuff and the more long-term options for dealing with it. There are a lot of really good resources. A lot of energy suppliers and water suppliers have discounted tariffs or other schemes available to help people in debt, as well as trust funds that can just, potentially entirely write off debts as well. And if people are eligible, being aware of the benefit system, or at least knowing that it's an option you might be able to look at and at least check, I think is very important. Obviously, Rory said, turn to us as the benefits calculator. That also has a grant search, so you can put in your basically things like your gender, your age, your postcode, some specific types of jobs. Like if you worked in certain industries, sometimes there's support available, and that grant search is really useful. Sometimes it's help with like white goods, but there's all sorts of different stuff. So that's a really good resource. The National Debtline website has a budgeting tool that you can use, and that actually produces what's called a standard financial statement, which we produce as part of our appointments. And with us, we need to see your proof of income and identity, but the National Debtline one actually produces a standard financial statement without needing that. So if you are wanting to sort of try and deal, if you think you're in a situation where you can deal with the debts by yourself, or maybe you just want to make offers of payment, or something that is more straightforward where you don't think you need necessarily expert debt advice, that's a really useful resource, because when you use that, it means the creditors know that it's sort of an approved budget, and that it's accurate. And obviously just being aware that, I think, like say, the main thing, and obviously part of our job, is saying to people, this is the situation with your debts. But I think a lot of it, and sort of the ones that I find more rewarding as an advisor, are the ones where it's somebody who maybe comes into the appointment very low, maybe sometimes a bit angry about things, I'm not going to lie, but not necessarily angry at us, but just angry in general at the situation they're in. And, I can call to mind now with, quite a few clients where I've started the call and they've been very upset or very depressed, maybe even talking about not wanting to be here and those sorts of things, which obviously aren't nice things to hear another human being say. But the amount of times that by the time we've finished the call, even if they're not, they're not debt free, they're not, their situation hasn't magically been fixed, but they're much a step further forward than they were. And sometimes just having that light at the end of the tunnel, even if it is only a little bit, is a big thing for people. So I think it's important to just remember the support is out there. Like I say, there's a lot of other people who are dealing with unfortunately similar situations, but there is advice and there are options available. And even if it's just a small thing to get the ball rolling, that is a massive thing. And especially if people have been dealing with it for a long time, that can feel like, you know, a massive change and really change people's lives for the better in the long run as well. So yeah, just definitely, you know, do what's best for you, do what's best for your family, and if you think you're ready to get advice, then reach out and get it, because there's services like ourselves and many others as well. You know, Step Change and National Debtline and those sorts of organisations also can give advice as well. So, you know, if you don't want to come to us for whatever reason, there are other ways to get debt advice if you need it.
Wonderful, thanks, Andy. And is there anything you wanted to add to that, Rory?
I think Andy's covered most of it, but yeah, I mean, I'd probably just re-emphasize, you know, just communicating. Again, you know, whether that be with, you know, family members, whether that be with your local Citizens Advice or with any other charity that offers debt advice, or with your suppliers, because, you know, as I said, you know, everyone's sort of going through this cost of living crisis. But you know, there is support out there. I think, you know, suppliers are, you know, acknowledging, you know, through their financial hardship departments that, you know, people are going to go through these struggles and are offering support to help. And then, as I said, you know, there are obviously charities like us, Citizens Advice, and then other charities, you know, places like Shelter, or even mental health charities like Mind. You know, there is that support there. I just think that if you can avail from it, you know, just try and do that, or even just try the first small step, whether that be just having a conversation with a friend or family member, or even, you know, maybe just writing down a few notes about, you know, what your situation is, and, you know, just trying to address it. Because as I said, you know, a small step or a big step, it doesn't really matter. It's just the first step in actually, you know, addressing the issue.
That's great, wonderful. Well, thank you. On that sort of hopeful note that there is help out there and there is a light at the end of the tunnel, I'm going to wrap up there. Thank you so much for your time, Andy and Rory, and thank you to anyone who has tuned in either live or on catch up. And we'll see you again soon. Bye.
Goodbye.